The moment my father remarried, I knew my life was about to change, but I had no idea how dramatically. For years, I had been the quiet, dutiful child, someone who never demanded more than what my family could give, someone who watched over the household while my father worked tirelessly to provide for us. My father, a man of immense pride and a complicated heart, had always tried to balance love and justice within our family. But when he met her, my stepmother, it was as if all reason and fairness had vanished. She was everything my father adored, charming, persuasive, and always perfectly poised. The kind of woman who could smile at you while making you feel insignificant in the same breath. I had met her only a few times before the wedding, and I sensed immediately that her intentions toward me were not kind. She didn't hide her disdain. There were fleeting moments when she looked at me and my brother as though we were obstacles rather than family. Her subtle glances, the dismissive tone when she addressed me, and the little hints of manipulation I caught in whispered conversations made my stomach knot with unease. It all escalated the night of their wedding. The house, once warm with familiar laughter and traditions, was filled with strangers and the kind of forced cheer that left my brother and me standing like spectators in a theater we no longer belonged to. My father, lost in his happiness, seemed unaware of the tension, while she effortlessly orchestrated every moment to ensure her presence dominated the evening. She smiled at my father in a way that could melt hearts, yet the cold calculation in her eyes when she looked at me sent a chill down my spine. For weeks after the wedding, everything began to shift. My father, who had always been my anchor, became distant. I noticed the subtle change in his behavior, the delayed responses, the slight irritation when I asked questions about the estate, and the way he deferred more and more decisions to her. She began suggesting changes to family routines, asking him to reconsider wills, property divisions, and business shares. I tried to speak up once, gently asking if we could discuss the estate fairly, but she was quick to dismiss me. "It's already settled," she said, her voice deceptively sweet. "You'll understand when you're older." My father didn't contradict her. The day it all became real is etched into my memory. I had been summoned to his study under the pretense of discussing family matters. The air felt thick with tension, as if the room itself was aware of what was about to happen. My father sat behind his massive oak desk, papers neatly stacked in front of him. He looked tired, but there was also a sense of determination in his eyes, a certainty I had never seen before. Beside him sat my stepmother, her posture immaculate, her smile unyielding. "I need to speak to you about the future of the family," my father began, his tone heavy but deliberate. My heart skipped a beat. I had a vague premonition of what was coming. "We've decided to transfer the majority of my assets and holdings to your brother." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sat frozen, unable to speak. My brother, who had been quietly sitting nearby, looked equally stunned, but his shock quickly gave way to a smug smile, one that told me he had anticipated this. My father continued, "This decision is for the benefit of the family, and to ensure stability with your stepmother involved in managing these affairs." Every fiber of my being rebelled. "But, what about me? What about everything I've done for this family? My loyalty, my care, none of that matters?" My voice trembled, though I tried to make it sound steady. My father's eyes softened for a fleeting moment, a ghost of the man I knew, the man who had taught me right from wrong, and then he looked away. "It's not about deserving, it's about what's best for the family now," he said quietly. His words were gentle, almost apologetic, but the damage was irreversible. My stepmother's smile widened, victorious but calm, as if she had orchestrated this moment from the very beginning. Her presence alone seemed to magnify the betrayal. I could feel her satisfaction radiating toward me like heat from a fire I couldn't escape. I left the study in a daze. Each step down the hallway felt surreal, as though I were walking through someone else's life. The house, once familiar, now seemed foreign. Rooms I had known since childhood felt like traps. Even the walls, adorned with family photos, seemed to mock me. My father, The man I had trusted above all else, had betrayed me, willingly and completely. In the days that followed, I watched the fallout unfold. My brother, emboldened by his sudden fortune, flaunted his new privileges, treating me as if I were invisible. My stepmother's influence grew stronger with each passing hour. She manipulated family gatherings, business decisions, and even casual conversations to reinforce the narrative that I no longer mattered. My father, now softened by his affection for his new wife, failed to intervene. I tried to reach out to him, hoping that behind the eyes of the man I loved and respected, there would be a flicker of regret or recognition. But each attempt was met with polite distance or gentle dismissal. It became clear, my place in the family, once secure and respected, had been obliterated. Even outside the home, whispers reached me, friends, relatives, even neighbors subtly reinforcing the new hierarchy. "Your brothers inherited everything, right?" they asked casually, never realizing the dagger those words drove into my chest. I smiled politely, masking the storm of anger, hurt, and disbelief that brewed inside me. As I lay awake at night, countless questions haunted me. How could my father, the man who had taught me to value justice, morality, and loyalty, turn his back so completely? How could my stepmother manipulate him so effectively, turning love into a tool for personal gain? And most importantly, was there any way to reclaim what had been unjustly taken from me? It was in those silent, lonely nights that I began to remember my grandfather's words. He had passed away years ago, but his advice lingered in my memory, offering a lifeline. Always know your rights. The law favors the prepared, not the betrayed. Never allow someone else's greed to define your future. I clung to those words like a shield. They reminded me that I was not powerless. Though my father had failed me, and my brother had grown arrogant with his sudden fortune, I still had the means to fight back. And so, amidst the heartbreak, humiliation, and anger, a spark ignited within me, a quiet but relentless determination. I vowed that my stepmother's manipulation and my father's blindness would not define my life. There was a path forward, hidden beneath the layers of betrayal, and I was determined to find it. The house, once a symbol of safety and love, had become a battlefield. Every smile from my stepmother, every boast from my brother, and every dismissive word from my father fueled my resolve. I began observing, listening, and collecting information quietly. I paid attention to legal papers, estate documents, and small oversights that hinted at vulnerabilities in the plans they thought were flawless. Each day, I reminded myself, their arrogance, their belief in my helplessness, was their greatest mistake. They had underestimated me completely. While they celebrated their perceived victory, I was quietly preparing the foundation for a reckoning they would never see coming. By the end of those weeks, the reality was undeniable. I had been betrayed. I had been dismissed, erased, and made to feel powerless. Yet, amidst the despair, I felt something stronger, clarity. I realized that the very systems my father had tried to manipulate for his new family could be used to restore my rightful place. I didn't yet know exactly how, but the seed of strategy, sown by my grandfather's wisdom, had begun to grow. Betrayal had a way of teaching lessons no one else could. I had learned that loyalty could be exploited, love could be manipulated, and authority could be blind. But I had also learned resilience, patience, and the power of preparation. And as I stared at the empty spaces of my home that once felt like mine, I made a silent promise: they would not win. Not completely. Not permanently. The silence after the betrayal was suffocating, yet within that quiet, a spark of determination began to flicker. I remembered my grandfather's words, which had always lingered in the corners of my mind, waiting for the moment I would need them most. They may betray you, but some truths cannot be stolen. Study, observe, and never underestimate the power of knowledge. At the time, as a child, I had nodded politely, thinking them the ramblings of an old man. Now, I understood their gravity. His wisdom was no idle lesson, it was a blueprint, a survival guide for the treacherous world of family, power, and wealth. I returned to his old study, the one room I had always loved as a child. Dust motes danced in the sunlight spilling through tall windows, and the faint scent of aged paper and cedar filled the air. It had been months since my grandfather passed away, yet stepping into the room felt like walking into his presence. His bookshelves, overflowing with law texts, family records, and personal journals, called out to me, offering knowledge he had deliberately left behind. One leather-bound journal caught my attention. It was thick, worn, and tied with a faded ribbon. My grandfather had always been meticulous, and I sensed immediately that this journal held insights meant only for someone who knew how to look. Carefully, I untied the ribbon and opened the pages. There, in his neat handwriting, were notes about the family estate, legal clauses, and even potential vulnerabilities in my father's will. It was a map of power disguised as scribbled advice. He had anticipated betrayal, not just by strangers, but by the very people closest to me. My stepmother, with her charm and cunning, and my father, blinded by love, were exactly the type of people he had warned me about. He had written about the importance of safeguarding one's legal rights, of documenting every interaction, and of identifying clauses in wills and contracts that could never legally be ignored, no matter the family dynamics. I spent hours in that study, reading every note, comparing them to the current situation, and marking points of leverage. My grandfather's foresight was astonishing. He had predicted that my inheritance might one day be threatened by external influence, an ambitious spouse, a manipulative sibling, or even a naive parent. And he had built contingencies into his planning, subtly embedding protections that only someone diligent and patient could discover. One section stood out, a hidden clause in my father's will. My grandfather had made a note about it in shorthand, warning, if the eldest son is given assets outside standard protocol, the daughter's right remains legally enforceable. Must produce proof. My heart raced. This was it, the seed of hope I had been seeking. The clause was obscure, buried beneath layers of legal language, but it was my lifeline. With this, the seemingly impossible could become reality. I realized, too, that preparation would not be limited to paperwork. Knowledge alone was insufficient. I needed evidence of my father's and stepmother's actions, the precise dates, signatures, and any documentation showing the transfer of wealth. I began to retrace every financial step, every legal maneuver, and every familial decision that had led to my disinheritance. It was painstaking work, but my grandfather's guidance had taught me that patience and meticulousness were as powerful as any courtroom argument. Days turned into weeks. I moved with stealth, observing my brother's arrogance and my stepmother's manipulations, quietly recording every inconsistency and every misstep. I took photographs of contracts, made detailed notes about conversations, and cross-checked every fact against my grandfather's journal. Even my father, unaware of my actions, continued his life in blind satisfaction, believing he had acted in everyone's best interest. One afternoon, I discovered a folder in my father's study that had been carelessly left behind. It contained copies of property deeds, business ownership certificates, and the updated version of his will, all signed under the influence of my stepmother. My pulse quickened. This was the proof I needed to corroborate the clause my grandfather had highlighted. Every signature, every date, every alteration, all of it could be used to legally challenge the transfers that had been made to my brother. But the real challenge was strategy. I couldn't rush. I couldn't confront them immediately. My grandfather's notes emphasized timing. The law is slow, but precise timing ensures maximum impact. Let arrogance blind them. Let them act first, it strengthens your position. I smiled, recalling his sharp wit. Patience had always been a family virtue, and now it was my weapon. While outwardly maintaining a calm facade, I began reaching out to legal advisors discreetly, without revealing my intentions. I researched inheritance law, trusts, and succession clauses applicable to my situation. Every conversation, every consultation reinforced the notion that I had been systematically prepared for this exact scenario. My grandfather had thought of everything, even the possibility that my father's influence could complicate proceedings. As weeks passed, I felt my confidence grow. The betrayal I had experienced became fuel rather than despair. My grandfather's wisdom had transformed my anger into a calculated plan. I began to understand the subtle power dynamics at play, my stepmother's control over my father, my brother's overconfidence, and my own underestimated resilience. One evening, alone in the study, I allowed myself a moment to reflect. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind, "You are never powerless, not if you understand the law, not if you know your worth, not if you prepare." Those words, once simple advice, had become a doctrine. I realized that my father's betrayal, my brother's arrogance, and my stepmother's scheming could all be countered, not with rage, but with foresight and precision. By the end of the month, I had built a comprehensive dossier, contracts, wills, bank statements, and notarized documents that all aligned perfectly with my grandfather's secret instructions. I had anticipated their weaknesses, documented every transfer, and identified the exact legal loophole that could restore what had been stolen. The empire that my stepmother and brother believed was secure was, in reality, highly vulnerable. Every night, I reviewed my plan, imagining the moment I would finally confront the family in court. The anticipation was electric. I felt no malice toward my grandfather's spirit, only gratitude. He had given me more than advice, he had handed me a roadmap to justice, a key to unlock a future that had been unfairly denied. The house, once a place of betrayal and despair, now became my laboratory of strategy. I moved silently, observing, calculating, and preparing. Every gesture from my stepmother, every boast from my brother, and every indifferent glance from my father became data points in my growing plan. I was no longer merely the wronged daughter, I was a strategist, ready to reclaim what was mine. And yet, amid all this planning, I kept my emotions in check. My grandfather had warned, anger clouds judgment. Patience and clarity win battles the heart cannot see. I embraced that wisdom fully. Each decision, each step, was deliberate, precise, and calculated. The family who thought they had outsmarted me had, unknowingly, strengthened my resolve. As part 2 drew to a close, I finally allowed myself a quiet moment of satisfaction. The foundation had been laid. The tools were in place. The plan, rooted in my grandfather's foresight and nurtured by my own diligence, was ready to be executed. What my father, stepmother, and brother had perceived as my defeat was, in truth, the calm before a storm they could not possibly anticipate. The day of reckoning arrived quietly, without fanfare. I had spent months preparing, ensuring every piece of evidence, every document, every detail of my grandfather's secret plan was airtight. What my father, my brother, and my stepmother believed was a complete victory, the wealth, the houses, the businesses, was about to crumble under the weight of truth and law. I arrived at the family estate early that morning. The sun cast long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns, as if even the light itself sensed the tension within these walls. My stepmother, already aware of some brewing challenge, greeted me with a smile that tried to mask her unease. My brother, confident and arrogant, casually boasted about his recent acquisitions, the wealth he assumed would never be questioned. My father sat in his study, distracted and preoccupied, oblivious to the storm about to descend. I had rehearsed every detail, every word, but even with all preparation, the emotions surged within me. This was more than a legal battle, it was a reclamation of identity, dignity, and justice. I carried my grandfather's journal, meticulously annotated copies of every legal document, and an air of quiet determination that I hoped would unsettle them before the first word was even spoken. We gathered in the study, the same room where my father had first betrayed me. It felt almost poetic. The air was thick with expectation, every heartbeat amplified. I placed the folder on the desk and looked directly at my father. I believe it's time we revisited the family estate, I said, my voice steady, calm, but carrying an unmistakable authority. My stepmother's eyes flickered, betraying the first crack in her composed facade. My brother, who had always measured his power by wealth and possession, laughed lightly. And what exactly are you going to do? He sneered. Everything is mine now. I opened the folder slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of my presence fill the room. Everything? I asked. You may have believed that, but the law, and my grandfather, have something to say about it. I began laying out the evidence, step by step. Every transfer of assets, every alteration in the will, every signature and date that had seemed unassailable was cross-referenced with legal clauses my grandfather had highlighted decades ago. He had anticipated not only the possibility of my stepmother's interference but also my father's unwillingness to fully enforce his own judgment. As I spoke, the room grew tense. My father's eyes widened in disbelief. My stepmother's carefully constructed composure faltered, and my brother's smug confidence began to crack. He leaned forward, scanning the documents, trying desperately to find a flaw, a loophole he could exploit. But the preparation, the meticulous documentation, and the legal weight of my grandfather's foresight left no room for error. I could see the realization dawn in their expressions. They had underestimated me completely. Every boast, every dismissal, every moment they had believed themselves secure was now a liability they could not undo. My grandfather's wisdom, combined with my patient, careful strategy, had neutralized the arrogance that had blinded them for so long. Then, the final blow. I revealed the clause in my grandfather's journal, hidden, subtle, and binding, that explicitly safeguarded my inheritance regardless of my father's later transfers. The law was unequivocal. Any transfer executed without considering my rights as outlined in the clause was invalid. Legally, my share could not be denied. The silence was deafening. My father, who had once seemed so composed and in control, looked as though the air had been pulled from the room. My stepmother's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a paper she had previously assumed would secure her victory. My brother's face, flushed with anger and disbelief, betrayed a combination of shock and fear. I continued, carefully explaining how each document aligned with my grandfather's instructions, leaving no room for misinterpretation. By the time I had finished, the reality was unavoidable. The estate, the wealth, the properties, they were legally mine to reclaim. The empire they had assumed belonged to them alone was being dismantled, piece by piece, through the very laws they had ignored and the foresight they had dismissed. My father attempted to speak, to apologize, to offer some last-minute negotiation, but the words faltered on his lips. The betrayal was clear, but so was the law. He realized, too late, that his loyalty to my stepmother had cost him the balance he had tried to maintain. My grandfather's wisdom had outlived him, guiding me even after his passing, turning his foresight into a weapon against those who had thought me powerless. As I filed the formal legal claim, my emotions were a mixture of triumph, relief, and vindication. The process was methodical and deliberate. Every signature, every notarized confirmation, and every clause was in place. What had seemed like an impossible comeback now unfolded like a carefully orchestrated symphony. By the end of the week, the estate had been legally adjusted. I had reclaimed what was rightfully mine. The wealth, the businesses, the houses, all returned to my hands, and the arrogance of my stepmother and brother had been shattered. They could no longer manipulate, boast, or claim dominance over what I had fought for. The final confrontation left lasting consequences. My stepmother, once so certain of her control, retreated into silence, her schemes rendered powerless. My brother, who had measured his self-worth by the wealth he thought was his, was forced to confront the reality that arrogance and entitlement could not override law and preparation. My father, humbled and regretful, realized the depth of his mistake. He had allowed love and favoritism to cloud his judgment, and the results had been catastrophic, not for me, but for the family harmony he had tried to maintain. Standing in the study, I felt the weight of my grandfather's presence. Though he was gone, his wisdom had guided me, protected me, and ultimately restored justice. Betrayal had tested me, but preparation, patience, and foresight had ensured my victory. I was no longer powerless. I was not a passive observer of injustice. I had become the architect of my own reclamation, and nothing could take that away. The house, once a symbol of betrayal, now stood as a monument to resilience and justice. Every hallway, every photograph, every piece of furniture witnessed my journey from powerless to victorious. My grandfather's secret, his hidden guidance, had not only preserved my rights but had also taught me the ultimate lesson: foresight and preparation can overcome even the deepest betrayals. In the end, I reclaimed more than wealth. I reclaimed my dignity, my identity, and my rightful place in the family. They had underestimated me, dismissed me, and erased me, but the final truth was undeniable. I was the true heir. The empire, once thought lost to manipulation and favoritism, was legally and morally mine. And as I looked around, I realized the greatest triumph was not the fortune, it was the knowledge that even in the darkest betrayal, wisdom, patience, and careful planning could turn defeat into unprecedented victory. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind: justice delayed is not justice denied. Always prepare, always observe, always reclaim what is yours.